Hello, I'm Simon Owens, and this is The Business of Content, the show about how publishers create, distribute, and monetize their digital content. For today's episode, I interviewed a guy named Dave Hanley. A few years ago, Dave co-founded a company called AdvertiseCast, and it started out basically as a podcast advertising marketplace where podcasters could sign up and advertisers could sign up, and it helped them find each other. But as the product got more and more mature and he developed more features, AdvertiseCast started incorporating in programmatic advertising, automatic advertising inserts into podcasts, very sophisticated podcast advertising. And a few years ago, it was acquired by Libsyn, which is one of the oldest podcast hosting companies that was founded all the way back in like 2004. And over the last few years, Libsyn has been acquiring several different podcast tech companies, including AdvertiseCast, including like a subscription tool. What it's doing is it's trying to kind of diversify its product offerings so it can compete with like rising podcast behemoths like Spotify and SiriusXM, which are pulling together the hosting, the distribution, the advertising, and the subscriptions all into one package so that they're more enticing to creators. So Libsyn is basically assembling all these tools and product features together to compete with that. So in my interview with Dave, we talked about, how he helped co-found AdvertiseCast, how he started finding initial podcasters to join it, the growth of advertising within podcasts, and then what was kind of behind the acquisition for Libsyn, and then talking about now, like how he's enticing podcasters to come into the Libsyn ecosystem, how they're recruiting kind of the next generation of podcast stars. So it was a really interesting conversation, not just about AdvertiseCast and Libsyn, but the entire podcast ecosystem as a whole and how all these large platforms are thinking about competing with each other. So it's a really cool conversation. But before we get into that, I want to talk about this week's sponsor. That sponsor is Memberful. Memberful is membership software used by some of the most prominent individual creators and content organizations on the web. Here are a few reasons you should diversify your revenue stream with Memberful. Memberful allows you to create sustainable recurring revenue. Your brand is front and center. Memberful fades into the background. Memberful has everything you need to run a membership program, including custom branding, gift subscriptions, Apple Pay, free and paid trials, private podcasts, in-house newsletters, referrals, and tons more. Memberful seamlessly integrates with the tools you already use. You have full control and ownership of your audience, your brand, and your membership. Memberful is a world-class support team ready to help you simplify your memberships and grow your revenue. They're passionate about your success, and you'll always have access to a real human. Get started for free at memberful.com/Simon Owens. That's memberful.com/Simon Owens. I'll leave a link in the description. Okay, now on to my interview with Dave. Hey Dave, thanks for joining me.
Hey Simon, good to be here.
So let's first start out by talking about how you got interested in podcasting, because you came from a completely unrelated industry, right? Like you weren't working in media or anything like that.
Yeah, so long story short, I started my career kind of in tech, working on founding teams for two companies that was in a totally different industry. I was actually involved with the insurance and risk management industry, so something very different than media, very different than podcasts. And essentially, after about 14 years in that business, it was kind of time to do something different. I needed a new challenge, and basically, I had an exit back in 2016. Decided to take some time off, and I tried to, not work for 6 months and really just think about what I was going to do next. And I think it lasted for about.
And you were like obsessively listening to podcasts.
Yeah, especially during that period. So essentially, I took some time off, get up in the morning, take the dog out for a walk, listen to podcasts, and really all my kind of downtime, which was a lot during that period, I was listening to different podcasts, different topics, business, entrepreneurship, golf, all kinds of different interests, and. After...
And were you like listening to ads, and were you thinking about the ads, or was that not really something you paid
I had listened
to
different shows for kind of years up until that point. And what I certainly noticed around that time is I started to think, I'm hearing a lot more ads than I used to, kind of early, call it 2010, 2011, 2012, you didn't hear as many ads, as I did, during that period in, say, call it 2015, 2016. And really the wheels started to turn a little bit. And then the stories actually, I woke up in the middle of the night one night and I thought, in my dreams, kind of weird, but I'm like, okay, I think there's something here where you've got a marketplace, you got advertisers on one side, podcasts on the other side, and we just basically connect the dots via an online marketplace. So I got up, wrote it down on a little piece of paper, and then when I woke up in the morning, I just went to Google and Googled it, and I said, look at this thing called AdvertiseCast actually exists. And so I just emailed the, hello at AdvertiseCast, and this guy named Trevor got back to me and said, hey, we just actually started this thing. We've got a lot of demand for the podcaster side, a lot of shows that are looking to monetize. But on the advertiser side, because it's so new and they don't have a lot of experience with advertising on podcasts, what he found was people would come in the door, they'd do some research, look at a bunch of different shows, but they didn't really know how to take the next step. And me having kind of like a sales background and, in addition to kind of starting companies and growing them and that type of thing, I said to Trevor, look, I think the big issue here is that people need to be educated, and they need to kind of, you need to take their hand, walk them down the path and kind of get them into the space before they can actually really, embrace this kind of new channel.
So you didn't know anything, you didn't know like advertising terms, you didn't know what CPM was, you didn't know what click-through rate, any of that stuff is when you did
No, so really all I came to the table with when I was talking to Trevor was I said, hey, I think we need to go out, educate advertisers, and really teach them everything there is to know about podcast advertising. And I think, because it's something that I believed in, having listened to podcasts and having bought things that I heard about on podcasts, I believed in it, and I knew that it worked. And I'm kind of a big proponent of, I want to constantly be learning, constantly challenging myself. And so something like that where I'm like, well, I don't even know anything about media or advertising. It didn't really kind of faze me, which is, I think a bit strange. But really what Trevor and I decided was, hey, let's try this out for 6 months, see if we get along, see if we work well together. And then if it does, then we'll partner up and we'll kind of go after this whole thing. So really, for the first 6 months, for the last half of, I think, 2017, worked together and took the business from doing very little revenue at all to, hundreds of thousands of dollars over that 6 month period. We figured, hey, this is working. So then we decided to, take it full scale, actually registered the company, 2018, and then started, kind of started hiring a couple more people, building a team. And then the business just took off. And I think our trajectory was like, for the first half of, for the last half of 2017, it was, I don't know, maybe $300 and some odd thousand in revenue. The next year was about 3 million. The next year was about 8 million. The next year was about 12 million.
So, like, can you explain how the product like initially worked? Like, it was just a marketplace that connected both sides. Like, you weren't doing anything to facilitate the ads other than trying to connect podcasters with advertisers and then taking a cut.
Yeah, exactly. Really, the initial concept of the marketplace was that it was really self-serve. So an advertiser would come in, they'd say, hey, I'm looking to advertise on business podcasts. They search, they filter, and then they can place a buy on podcasts for their brand. And then the podcasters can go and, kind of use the talking points that they gave, talk about the product. They can, maybe get a sample product. And really, it was the marketplace. But then there was a little bit of like back end, really order management, because, a lot of times there's a lot of back and forth on these types of campaigns where it's like, hey, I have a question. Okay, we got new copy. All this back and forth stuff is something that's really challenging.
So it's kind of like users might be familiar with like an Upwork or a Fiverr or something like that.
Very similar,
specifically for podcasters and advertisers. And you said that like your job as a salesperson was to kind of connect or get people onboarded onto this, because 5-6 years ago, a lot of brands had never bought a podcast ad. It wasn't part of their workflow. You needed to educate them on how to navigate
exactly
this arena, right?
Yeah, because it was so different. I mean, a lot of the advertisers would come over from the digital side, so they were running a lot of Facebook ads, for example, and then they had questions about how podcast advertising worked. And then even the brands that were more used to like broadcast, like radio, television, and those types of channels, they had questions too. because they're asking, hey, do we do a script? Do we do talking points? What kind of frequency do we have? Do we want to go on every episode, every other episode? And just a lot of different logistical questions. And I think, back then, more than maybe 9 or 10 out of 10 calls that we would have, someone says, I've never done this before, so start from the beginning. And it was really just education. And once we basically focused on that, then that's when things really started to click.
And what about recruiting podcasters? Like, was anybody able to opt in, or did they have to meet certain criteria?
I mean, early days, we kind of had an open door. It's like, hey, anybody and everybody, whoever wants to monetize, come on in. But as we, grew the business, really what we found was, there are certain criteria that podcasters needed to meet to be able to be interesting for advertisers. Back then it was a bit more the Wild West too. So for example, there was no IAB, certification in terms of, okay, what is a download and what does that mean for the advertiser? So you'd have different platforms and the numbers would be vastly different between those platforms. And so thankfully a few years later, that all, came to. And then if you're looking at a show that's on Libsyn versus a show that's on Megaphone or a show that's on, Buzzsprout, all of those downloads are essentially, very similar. It's not 100%, but it's very, very similar in terms of the measurement guidelines.
And then a lot of these advertising networks, they said their basic criteria was a floor on downloads, right? Like you had to have a minimum number of downloads because otherwise brands just weren't interested in, trying to go through all the work of advertising on a podcast that was only getting like 100 downloads per episode.
Exactly. And what we essentially found, and frankly, it might have gone a little higher today, but it's still around the same, is for an individual show to do a host-read ad, it's typically probably around that 10,000, download per episode range, where a brand is like, hey, there's enough there where it's worth spending the time, to basically place an ad or a campaign on this show from a host read perspective.
And then eventually the industry started changing, evolving, where it went from just purely direct response host read ads where they would read an ad and it would live on their podcast forever, to something called dynamic insertion, where there could be an advertising slot, and at the point of the download, the technology could insert an advertisement into it. So then you could change up your catalog, not just with new episodes, but it could be inserting newer ads into older episodes, so you could like monetize that back catalog. How did AdvertiseCast evolve with that kind of those changing needs?
Yeah, I mean, early days, Simon, things were very simple, right? So a show was producing content. They'd do an ad read that was basically in the episode. So you'd be talking about, last night's basketball game, and then you'd just go right into the ad talking about HelloFresh, for example. And that's baked into the content, and that term baked in was essentially what was used to describe how those ads were actually recorded and delivered. And basically things were, super, super simple. As the technology evolved, dynamic ad insertion basically allowed podcasters to monetize more of their catalog. But what that meant for advertisers is they weren't getting as much, kind of extra bonus as they were used to. Because on the baked in world, if you had 10,000 downloads per episode, keep in mind, that's a 30-day number. You might very well get 12,000, 15,000, 30,000 after, 6 months. So the advertisers loved it because they would get a lot more reach than what they paid for. But with the advent of dynamic insertion, that basically went away because that campaign is flighted. It's based on impressions as opposed to downloads. And really, you get what you pay for. So if you pay for 10,000, you get 10,000 because there's essentially a cap on it. And really, we've kind of evolved our business as things have, changed in the industry. We still do, some baked in ads today. We do some dynamic. We do some full catalog. We do some episodic. We're very much of the mindset that it's not one size fits all. So depending on the show, there's a different solution, so to speak, in terms of the best way to monetize that show. So we kind of custom build, how we sell each different podcast depending on, hey, is it a true crime show that gets a ton of back catalog traffic, or is it a news show that nobody listens to after 2 days? So there's very different ways there to think about it.
And some podcasters, including me, still do the baked in ads and sell it as like a point of differentiation, saying you're investing in my podcast as it continues to grow my archives because I do evergreen type of interviews. They're going to continue to pay dividends for you because your ad's going to appear in my podcast 6 months from now, 12 months from now, when people are going through my older episodes, and that's a plus for you. And I think some like indie podcasters still like that as kind of a benefit to advertisers, that their ad doesn't go away just as soon as their spend goes away.
Yeah, absolutely. And honestly, when you think about the early advertisers in the podcast world, it was mainly direct response advertisers, meaning those advertisers that are basically investing, $10,000 and are hoping to make 15,000 or 20,000. So they were the ones that really loved this baked in concept. And today, like I said, we still sell quite a few shows on a baked in basis. And a lot of those types of advertisers love that because they get that extra boost. Interestingly enough, now that there's more large brands coming into the podcast space, they don't like that because they really want to have, like, for example, it doesn't make sense to hear, a Macy's, Black Friday sale ad in July of the following year, on a true crime show, for example. So they actually like the concept of being able to time bound, those campaigns and really control that a little bit more. So there's kind of different ways to look at it depending on who you are.
So you guys had to build the tech for that, right, though? Because that's a very kind of burgeoning industry. It's still it's not, as mature as other kinds of digital advertising. So you had to kind of figure this out in real time, right?
Yeah, exactly. And, like I mentioned, when we first spoke, I came from a totally different industry. So literally the first calls that I had, somebody would say, "This sounds great, send me over an IO." And I go, "No problem, I'll get that right over." And then I had to Google, like, what is an IO, and try to find it.
What is an IO?
It's an insertion order. So it's basically an order to place an ad. Or a campaign. And, we had to figure out everything. Both Trevor and I had no media background, no advertising sales experience. So we figured out everything on the fly. And frankly, I think it was a bit of an advantage because we took a different approach. We kind of made it very accessible because, when we started digging around the industry, we found that some of the companies that were in the space were still using very much like radio type of operating procedures. So for example, we would see one of the orders that came over from a company that had more of like a radio background, and I'd read it and I go, I don't even know what this means. I can't decipher this, and I actually do this every day. So we wanted to make it very simple to say, look, if you've never done podcast advertising before, let's make it super, straightforward, accessible, lay everything out real simply so that there's no, hurdles and different barriers to getting involved.
Was it like a self-service platform, or did they have to go through like a human being at AdvertiseCast to place their ads?
Yeah, so what's funny is, like I mentioned, when we first launched the platform, that was the idea, is that it was all self-serve. But because it was so new, people didn't know what they didn't know, so they weren't really, latching on and placing those orders. So really what we did is, and it's funny because today you see a lot of announcements like, so-and-so launches like a, one of the first of its kind, podcast advertising marketplaces. And we're like, well, we had that in 2016. But what we did is we actually stripped back a lot of the functionality. And when somebody came in the door, we would basically say, hey, you've got to this point, click here, reach out to our sales team, and we'll kind of walk you through the process. And that's what we did. And that's really what helped kind of take the business to the next level, is really kind of stripping back some of that functionality and then, giving them a full service approach. Now, today, we do have advertisers and agencies that are in there really executing everything themselves and doing it on a self-serve basis, which is great. And the ones that are doing that love it because they get to see, hey, new show came in the door. They get first view on that. They can see in real time, hey, let's check out these air checks and, hear the latest ads from all these shows that are on the campaign. So there's a lot of good benefits to it. But what we did learn, obviously, early days is that, media buyers sometimes buy a lot of different channels. They like to do things the way they like to do things, and a lot of times that's on spreadsheets and other systems. So what we've done is kind of work to accommodate that. So in our system, if somebody wants a proposal in Excel, okay, we'll produce it in Excel. If somebody wants to view a proposal in their media buying platform, we've actually done a few integrations so far with media buying platforms so that they can actually look at their freewheel system, for example, and look at a proposal in there and execute a buy. And a lot of this is just about reducing the friction so that, the media buyers and brands can actually really easily do business with us the way they can do it with, older channels like TV and radio.
So a few years ago, you were acquired by Libsyn, which is one of the oldest podcast hosts. This podcast you're listening to right now is hosted on Libsyn. How did that acquisition come about?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, kind of 2018 is when we really, kind of started growing the business, hiring people. Trevor and I both have kind of like call it traditional business background where we actually, bootstrapped the business. We were profitable probably, a few months in. We never raised any outside capital. And I think we just got a really good reputation in the business because, we had a great system, yes, but we had a really good team. We treated podcasters, really well. We paid them out quickly. And I think the word started to get out that like, hey, AdvertiseCast has something going on here. And then we started getting a few companies reach out to us and saying, hey, we like what you guys are doing. Let's talk, strategic, type of discussions. And none of those were that interesting until we started speaking with the Libsyn team. And really our initial, kind of perceptions were like, Libsyn is kind of like an older company. They've been around for a while. They're just hosting. But what was really happening kind of inside the company was that there was kind of a transformation going on. So there was a new management team, new board, some new investors, and they were really looking to take the company from just hosting to really like a full, podcaster creator platform. And really what that means is, and kind of where we're at today is that, yes, we have, Libsyn has 75, 80,000 shows that are hosted on Libsyn. We've got host-read advertising, obviously, through our team. We've got a solution called Glow for subscription, premium content monetization. We actually also have a solution for hosting, for podcast websites, so shows can have an online presence. And really just giving podcasters and creators everything they need to be successful. And the other thing that we saw as a really interesting kind of synergy between us and Libsyn is that, a lot of the industry was kind of moving towards this, like, call it programmatic, although we don't love to use that term because it's, sometimes frowned upon for many reasons. But really like, passive, automated, like produced ads that can be inserted into a podcast. A lot of momentum, happening in that area with Megaphone and certain platforms like that over the last few years. And really Libsyn was sitting on, 75, 80,000 shows that had none of that monetization. So that's something that we saw as a big opportunity, and we've actually just kind of quietly launched our beta in the last few months. The shows are really embracing it, and we're seeing that as a really great option for shows to either get additional monetization on top of their host-read ads, or some shows don't want to do host-read ads, or they're too small for host-read ads, and they can basically get that, kind of programmatic revenue stream, passive, and essentially they can start to generate some revenue for their show. So that is one of the really great synergies we saw. And, from our perspective, this was 2021, summertime when we actually became part of Libsyn. The market was getting more competitive. We had a great business going, but we wanted to kind of take things to the next level, and we thought it made a lot of sense.
And so the synergy is that there's 75,000 podcast hosting, and so you can connect your advertising tech to that hosting data and see consumption patterns and get richer data that advertisers can target against a little bit better.
Yeah, I think there's a few things. Number one is, out of those 75,000 shows, there was many that weren't doing any advertising at all, that wanted to, but didn't really have a, path for that. And we were able to, give them a path. And that's something that we're still, kind of working on. But the other synergies are, one of the big challenges in the podcast world is that it is very, like some of the data is very much so behind the scenes. We wanted to bring a kind of a new level of transparency to that. So being able to say, hey, this show is hosted on Libsyn, here's very transparently, stats on this show, consumption patterns, growth, all those types of things. And really give that as a unique offering where advertisers can kind of really see what they're buying. And at the same time, we and Libsyn, we always shared the same type of philosophy that we want to do what's best for the creator, for the podcaster. So we don't force anybody to say, hey, you don't want to work with us, you have to go on Libsyn. We're very much platform agnostic, and they held that same belief. So today we still have, lots of shows that are hosted on other platforms that we help with host-read ads. Megaphone, Buzzsprout, Podbean, all those different platforms we work with, because we do, we're very focused on helping people be successful regardless of, what platform they want to use.
But the data, I'm guessing, isn't as rich if they're hosted on another platform, since you don't have access to their full listening data.
Yeah, I mean, we've got a couple of ways today that we work with those shows to kind of get visibility into their data, just so that, when we're selling a show at 25,000 downloads per episode, we can be assured that the advertiser is getting, that or more. And today we're working on some kind of integrations from a data perspective that will allow us to actually get even deeper into that. So not only can we give assurances that the advertiser is getting what they paid for, but that we can actually give them a little bit more visibility into, hey, you paid for X, you're getting Y, and you can actually see a little bit more real-time, consumption around that.
Well, how do you compete with like a Spotify, which now owns the hosting, the ad tech, and the distribution, so they can see how people are interacting with which shows in real time? Like, that's like even richer data. How does like Libsyn like pitch its value proposition versus like a Megaphone or an Anchor, which has direct access to Spotify's actual consumption data?
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that there's some value in having first-party data. In terms of, somebody signs up for the app and they have to give some specific information, age, gender, whatever the case may be. But what we found is that we can actually get almost as good data from third-party sources and kind of aggregate that to be able to actually give advertisers very similar insights into, what they're buying. And there's a lot of data out there. There's a lot of different providers, and it's just a matter of figuring out, what's important, layering that in, and giving them as much insight as they can. So, we're very much proponents of an open podcast ecosystem as opposed to, kind of walled off. And we think that, we can still give advertisers a really, really good value in terms of, that data and the audience, and really what they're interested in is who this audience is, and they want to do targeting. And they want to reach that audience in a really organic way. And we think we've really got a good proposition still without having that first-party data.
What kind of level of data, or what kind of level of targeting can people utilize? Like in terms of, it's getting the podcast file the audio file is getting pulled into the podcast player. At that point, you have no access into listener data or anything like that. So what level of targeting in terms of location, industry, different things like that can people target?
Yeah, on the targeting side, essentially, with dynamic ad insertion, you can look at primarily, from a host-read ad, geography. So you want to do a campaign that's, in 17 different states for your restaurant chain. We can do a host-read ad that's delivered to those geographies based on dynamic ad insertion. When you talk about the programmatic side, where essentially that's a pre-recorded ad that's going to be placed in, hundreds or thousands of different podcasts, that's when you can do some very granular targeting, because essentially what we have the capability to do now today is say, okay, we're going to run this campaign, but when we flight it, we can do geography, we can do those things that are, you could do, for example, people listening on a certain platform, Apple versus, different player apps or whatever. But what's more interesting is now we have the ability to use third-party data, layer that on top of the listenership, which is basically IP address, and it's really using device graph, capabilities that say, hey, this IP, based on all of the data that we have, is a household with these characteristics, these demographics, and we have the ability to do targeting based on those parameters. And that's where these campaigns get really interesting on the programmatic side, because you can do very granular targeting. But again, that's mostly in terms of the those programmatic type of campaigns as opposed to the host read. Now with the typical host read type of approach is, The show does an audience survey. They capture those statistics, and which is mainly demographics, age, gender, income, education. We have those in our platform so that when somebody's looking to do a host read campaign, they can filter by those demographics and say, okay, I'm looking to reach, females 25 to 45 with a certain household income. Well, what's going to happen is they're going to be able to target shows that index, above average on those demographics. Now, it's not 100% of the audience, but it really narrows in on, hey, the majority of that audience is in my, my target here. And that's been really effective because, one of the hardest things to do in the podcast world is figure out who that audience is. And we always drive, the shows that we work with to say, hey, learn your audience. That can be done through audience surveys, or it can also be done through using some tools that allow you to pull social media demographics kind of as a proxy for your listenership, if there's a good crossover there in terms of podcast listeners and say Twitter followers or Facebook, followers or whatnot.
What about the deterioration of podcast ad quality? Everybody's noticed that, now when some certain podcasts I open, I'm like poised with my finger on the button, ready to start fast forwarding through 5 different programmatic ads that aren't read by the host. Like, it's just seems like it's training an entire generation of podcast listeners to just be ready to skip forward through that.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's behind that is that when you think about the podcast world of the active podcasts that are out there, and we've got some data that shows there's 400,000 active podcasts. And what tends to happen when brands come into the space is that they really gravitate towards the top 1 or 2% of shows. And frankly, those shows might account for, 20-25% of podcast listenership. So what's essentially happened there is that there's so much demand for those top shows that the cost of advertising on those shows has gone up. The ad loads have gone up because people are demanding more and more and more ads from those shows, and people or networks want to monetize, more of that inventory. What's also happened is that it's no longer, kind of novel for the show to get an advertiser. It's like, oh, another advertiser. Let's do the ad read and kind of slap it in there. So I think the quality of ads at the top level has definitely deteriorated. But what we've seen and what we always push, advertisers to do is think about the shows that are in the other 98%, because those shows there's not as much demand, the rates are more reasonable, the ad load is lower, and the podcaster is actually engaged with that brand. They want to try the product, they want to talk about it in a way that's very organic. And they're super excited to get, an advertiser and work closely and kind of keep that relationship going. So that's where we see a lot of the opportunity. And what we do see is some of the long-term advertisers, they're like, well, I can't get any good ROI on these big shows anymore because of all these factors. Let's go downstream. And we love that because our sweet spot is kind of that middle market, of shows in terms of, monetization.
So like one thing that YouTube has mastered is the art of like opting in their creators with as few as like 1,000 subscribers into their inventory. How far do you think the podcast industry is towards like bringing in truly bringing in the long tail of podcasting into the advertising ecosystem so that creators can start monetizing much earlier? Yeah,
I mean, that's something that we're really focused on. So right now I mentioned we have that kind of like 10,000 threshold in terms of host read ads. We've got a couple kind of solutions, I guess, for the kind of the longer tail, we call it emerging podcasters, because frankly, like, there is the next, large podcast, in that, in that demographic today. And we want to offer them, number one, the whole like programmatic, or what we call auto ads. So being able to say, hey, I want to make some money. Let's get that show opted into these auto ads. We always recommend keeping that ad load very reasonable. Like, we don't want anybody to turn their audience off by doing that. Number two, what we have is the capability to bundle together a bunch of smaller shows into, a large reach, to say, hey, advertiser, this is an interesting way for you to reach very, unique audiences, very low, ad loads, highly engaged listeners. And that might look like, 65 shows that do, hundreds to a few thousand downloads per episode, all bundled together, that gives an advertiser 200,000, reach, which is very interesting. The other thing is the ability to offer through our Glow platform, essentially premium monetization. So, hey listeners, go sign up for my bonus episode that I release every Saturday, or ad free, or whatever the case may be, $2 a month, $5 a month, $10 a month, whatever that is. And then lastly, we also want to give these emerging podcasters some ability to grow their show. So that's always probably one of the hardest things to do in the podcast world. We brought a fellow on board to our team who's the head of audience development. He works with shows to essentially help them grow. There's all kinds of different tactics to do that. A lot of it is, kind of paid placements, kind of cross-pollination of audiences, and he's an expert in that. And that's something we're really excited about, is giving those emerging shows ideas, best practices to be able to grow the audience, so that someday they can, get on our radar in terms of, larger scale monetization.
So, you see Spotify and some other platforms who are starting to pull in exclusive shows to their walled gardens. People worry about the future of open podcasting. Do you think there always will be a component of open podcasting? Like, podcasts that are available on every platform that pulls in through an RSS feed?
Absolutely. I think the open podcast ecosystem isn't going anywhere. We've seen some cases of shows that went behind an exclusive, kind of walled platform, and then came back out because they didn't like the way that, things went. And maybe, as some of the reports have shown, it kind of reduces the influence of that individual. And I think that's what drives a lot of creators, is to kind of get their unique voice out there, reach the audience that they want to reach. And, I think, being in that kind of walled garden reduces the ability for creators to do that in a lot of cases.
And Libsyn, it's experimenting with exclusives, right? Like, it's still the podcasts are available on every podcast player, but you're paying like cash advances for them to host on Libsyn, so then you can fully monetize them and stuff like that. How is that?
Yeah,
going?
Absolutely. So we learned fairly early on that having exclusive podcasts to be able to offer to advertisers has a lot of value. And we've done that for, several years now. But, as you mentioned, just recently, over the last, year or two, it's become more common when, there's a really great podcast out there. It's getting more competitive from the content acquisition side. And there are cases where we're basically going to that podcaster or network and saying, hey, we want to represent you as your exclusive, advertising solution. And there might be some kind of, advance or minimum guarantee associated with that. We just announced one like today with a network called Bigger Pockets. It's a real estate investing platform that has, some really great podcasts. And really today, if you want to, work with some really great podcast publishers like that, that's kind of, the way you have to do it is kind of put some skin in the game and show them that you're, kind of a partner with them, and taking on some risk to be able to work with them.
So is the strategy there that you're trying to find kind of like these mid-tier podcasts that have some grassroots, like early, traction, but you're trying to get them right at the moment where you could take them to the next level, like being strategic in that way?
I mean, a lot of times that's actually worked out really well for us, that strategy. So for example, and I think Erica Mandy from the Newsworthy, we started working with Erica when she had a couple thousand, downloads per episode, and now she's doing, pretty big numbers. And we've kind of taken that ride along with Erica. Similar, Jack from Darknet Diaries. So I think, we started working with him. He had probably 10% of the audience that he has now, and he's grown, alongside us. And we absolutely love that, because one of the things that really excites us is that, and we've seen it quite a few times, is somebody comes to us and they have a podcast and they want to make it their full-time gig. And we love it when they go, hey, Dave, great news. I just quit my job and I'm doing this full time, which is, pretty exciting. So that's kind of what gets us up in the morning, and we love that. But, today we definitely have gone up market. We're starting to work with some of these bigger, podcasters that have a real business there. And we think we can do a really good job for them. But at the same time, like we're not ignoring those, ones that are kind of still, coming up and want to make a full-time living out of it.
Could you ever see Libsyn launching its own podcast player so that you have even richer data on listener habits?
I mean, our president and chief product officer is a fellow by the name of John Gibbons, and he was actually the former CEO of Pocket Casts. So he knows what type of game that is, being in the player, consumption app business, and it's tough. And I think like you've seen probably in the last few months, like Acast, I think they're getting rid of their player. It's a tough racket. So I don't know if I see that in our future. What I can see is potentially some more collaboration with some of the existing, apps out there, to be able to basically, work closely with them to get a little bit more, insights into the audience and have some kind of mutually beneficial relationship there. But even if you look at the bottom, I don't know, you got your Apple, you got your Spotify, everything else is, low single digit percentages. So you'd have to get quite a few of those collaborating to be able to get, data that's going to be statistically significant.
Like you see the industry kind of shifting towards video. More and more podcasters are uploading video. That's what I'm doing right now. Is I'm recording a video version of this that I can upload to YouTube. What are your thoughts on that in terms of having to build out the tech that makes that a little bit easier, or is that not really, that's something that you're just going to let a Squadcast or Zencaster do? You're not really going to be worried about that?
I mean, there's a couple things on that topic, Simon. Number one is, Libsyn is actually going to be launching a new solution, very much like what we're talking on today, in terms of allowing podcasters to basically create their content and connect with their guests and whatnot. But the other thing that we've seen in the last little while is that YouTube is becoming a real podcast consumption, destination. We acquired a business called PAR, Podcast Ad Reps, a few months back. I think it was like March. And they had, similar to what we had, a lot of, exclusive podcasts that they represented. But what they also had, which we didn't really do until that point, was podcasts that have really a presence on both, an RSS feed plus YouTube. And they really branded that as kind of a simulcast type of approach, where a show might have 20,000 podcast downloads per episode. They put the same content on YouTube and they might get, another 100,000, or maybe it's another 20,000. So there's different splits there in terms of the audience. But we definitely see that as a trend moving forward. And what we've been doing is just kind of packaging all that up as one, audience, podcast plus YouTube. And we are working in our system similar to how we're working in terms of getting more insights into the consumption on the RSS feed. We're also able to integrate now with YouTube to pull some of those analytics over to the platform to see, hey, they got their downloads plus the YouTube views, and that gives us, 100,000, listens and views of that content.
Cool. Well, Dave, thank you so much for joining me. Where can people find you online?
Yeah, Simon, thanks so much. I really enjoyed the conversation today. I'd say, obviously, if you're a podcaster out there and you want to learn about monetization or an advertiser, you can go to advertisecast.com. And if anybody wants to reach out to me, it's very simple, dave@advertisecast.com, probably the best way to get in touch, or on LinkedIn.
Well, this was a lot of fun. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thanks, Simon.